Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. Today, we're going to dive deep into someone who, well, he changed the world. I mean, really changed the world. It's a figure shrouded in legend and myth, Alexander the Great.
Alexander. You know what's so fascinating? It's not just about one man's ambition. His story, it's really a culmination of centuries of, Greek history, all that conflict, the cultural exchange, their military tactics, always evolving.
Yeah, that's true. It's funny. When we say ancient Greece, we don't think of a big empire like Rome, do we? I vaguely remember something about city-states, though.
You got it. Imagine like a patchwork of cities, each with its own thing going on. You've got Athens, famous for, all that democracy and philosophy. And then you've got Sparta, those warrior guys. Each had their own identity, and they often clashed with each other, big time.
So how did these city-states, who seem to be constantly bickering, stand any chance against like a massive empire like Persia?
Well, that's where the Persian Wars come in. Around 500 BC, the Persian Empire, which was like the superpower back then, decided, hey, let's expand westward. This huge clash of civilizations, it's what gave us those legendary stories, like the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartan warriors held off like a massive Persian force.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of that.
Just imagine that, right? This small band of soldiers making this heroic last stand against this like unstoppable tide.
It's an incredible image, that kind of defiance. But wait, the Greeks actually pushed back this giant empire. Really?
They did. They won some key victories, really against all odds, both on land and at sea. It wasn't just about survival, though. These victories, they fueled what many consider like the golden age of Greece. It was a surge in their confidence, their culture, everything. But even winning against a common enemy, it didn't erase those old rivalries.
So the tensions flared up again. Makes sense.
Exactly. Athens and Sparta, they eventually went to war with each other. The classic Greek tragedy, it really weakened the Greek world. And that's where a new power emerges from a place, honestly, that was considered a bit of a backwater. Macedonia?
Macedonia. Wasn't that Alexander's home?
You got it. And it wasn't exactly seen as like the center of Greek culture at first, but Alexander's father, King Philip II, he transformed it into a military powerhouse. He was a strategic genius. This guy, he introduced the sarissa. It was a spear, but like so long, it was almost like a mini pike.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, picture like rows of soldiers with these massive spears forming a wall of steel, the Macedonian phalanx.
Okay, so Philip takes this overlooked region and turns it into a force to be reckoned with. So what was his big plan?
He was smart. He combined diplomacy and military power. Imagine, like, through alliances, conquests, he united most of the Greek city-states under his rule. It was brilliant. He basically set the stage for his son Alexander to inherit, well, a unified Greece, something they'd never really had before.
Wow, what a legacy to inherit. So Alexander steps in, ready to take on Persia.
Well, not so fast. See, his father was assassinated when Alexander was only 20 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, crazy, right? But despite his youth, he was already a skilled leader. He'd been trained from like a very young age, tutored by Aristotle himself.
No way. The Aristotle.
Yep. Imagine the education this guy had, military strategy combined with, deep philosophical thinking.
That's impressive.
Oh, yeah.
So what were his first moves as king? I mean, surely there were some serious challenges right off the bat.
You bet. He couldn't just go charging off to Persia. First, he had to, secure his own power base. Rebellions broke out all over Greece, and he crushed them brutally. The destruction of Thebes, I mean, that was a major city-state. It sent a message. Alexander, he wasn't afraid to use force. At all.
Yeah, talk about decisive. Okay, so once things were settled in Greece, he finally turned his attention toward the Persian Empire.
Exactly. By 334 BC, Alexander was ready to launch his invasion. And his army, yeah, they were smaller than the Persian forces, but man, were they a well-oiled machine. They were diverse, too, troops from across the Greek world. It really shows his leadership that he could unite such a diverse force, under one banner.
Let's break down this army a bit. What made them so formidable? I mean, everyone's heard about those spear formations.
Ah, yes. The core, the heart of it all was the Macedonian phalanx, those heavily armed infantry with their those sarissas. I mean, nearly unstoppable when they were in formation, but they had a weakness on their flanks. They were vulnerable there. They needed protection, from faster units.
So it wasn't just this, like, slow-moving wall of spears.
Nope. Alexander, he also had his companion cavalry. These were elite shock troops. Think of them as like the special forces of the ancient world. Highly trained, and man, they could launch some devastating charges.
And Alexander led these charges himself.
Often, yeah, right in the thick of it. Imagine the king on horseback leading the most dangerous attacks. Risky, yeah, but incredibly inspiring to his troops.
Wow, talk about leading by example. So their first clash with the Persians, that was at the Granicus River, right?
Dingo, 334 BC, Alexander crosses into Asia Minor, and boom, first major battle happens at the Granicus. And you know what? This battle, it shows you, like, two things. Alexander's incredible daring, and the Persians, well, they made some early miscalculations.
Like what?
They had a chance. They could have used this scorched earth strategy, deny Alexander supplies, force him to retreat. It was a solid plan.
So they, what, rejected a good strategy? Why would they do that?
Overconfidence, I guess. The Persian satraps, their regional governors, they just thought, we got this. We can crush this young upstart with sheer numbers. They totally dismissed their own Greek advisor. He'd recommended a more cautious approach, but nope. It was a mistake they would definitely regret.
So they just, what, lined up their forces along the river and hoped to stop Alexander?
Pretty much. They deployed their cavalry along the riverbank. They figured, hey, terrain gives us the advantage. They even had some Greek mercenaries fighting for them. But man, did they underestimate Alexander's boldness.
Because he just attacks. Head on.
Yeah.
He doesn't hesitate.
Yep. Leading for front, across the river he goes. Risky attack. I mean, he nearly gets killed in a duel with some Persian nobles.
He nearly died. Got off the bat.
Yeah, can you imagine? The king of Macedon in hand-to-hand combat with the enemy.
That's wild. So does this crazy charge actually work?
It does, but not without a serious fight. While Alexander's right flank is battling the Persian cavalry, his general Perminion, he was facing a tough challenge over on the left, but it was the arrival of the Macedonian phalanx, those disciplined spearmen, that really turned the tide. The Persian cavalry, they broke, and the rout began. It was a brutal victory for Alexander. A real statement, you know, he was a force to be reckoned with.
The Granicus, it was a big win, that's for sure. It gave Alexander that initial foothold in Asia Minor. But it was just the beginning, right? The Persian Empire, it was massive.
Absolutely. The Granicus, just Act 1 in a much larger drama. The heart of the Persian Empire that was still further east, and Alexander, well, he wanted it all. It's a story of epic battles, cunning strategies, and, well, the relentless drive of this man determined to leave his mark on history.
Man, I am hooked. This is shaping up to be one heck of a deep dive.
After that victory at the Granicus, Alexander couldn't just, march straight into the heart of Persia.
Really, why not? What was stopping him?
The Persian navy, they had a powerful fleet, and they could have just, cut off his supply lines back to Greece.
Ah, I see. So it's not as simple as just marching across land. He had to worry about getting cut off.
Exactly. I mean, try conquering a vast empire while constantly worrying about your communications and reinforcements. It would be a strategic nightmare. Alexander had to deal with this.
Okay, so what did he do? Did he, challenge the Persians at sea? Weren't the Greeks pretty good at naval warfare?
They were. He could have, but he decided on a different approach. It was land-based, but it was designed to, neutralize the Persian fleet. Instead of a big naval battle, he went after their bases, the ones along the coast of Asia Minor.
Ah, clever. So, cut off the head of the snake, so to speak. Take out the bases, cripple the fleet.
Exactly. He laid siege to cities like Miletus and Halicarnassus, and they resisted. They fought hard. Sieges were brutal back then, but Alexander's forces, they were relentless. By winter, he had control of the coastline. The Persian navy, well, they couldn't really operate effectively anymore.
That's impressive, really. He outmaneuvered them without even a major sea battle. So with that threat neutralized, Alexander was finally free to march east into the heart of Persia.
Well, there were, still challenges and opportunities, like the story of the Gordian knot. It's a great example of Alexander's decisiveness and his sense of symbolism.
Oh, yeah, the Gordian knot. That knot, it was so complicated nobody could untie it. It had some kind of prophecy attached to it, too, didn't it?
Yeah, the legend said whoever untied it would rule all of Asia. So picture this, right? Alexander arrives, sees this knot, this famously complicated knot, and instead of messing with it for days, he just slices it in half with his sword.
No way. He just cut it. Talk about a power move.
Right, it was bold, it was decisive, and it played perfectly into the image he was cultivating. He wasn't going to get bogged down by, complexity. He'd find a solution, even if it meant breaking with tradition. A strong message for his troops and for the people he was conquering.
Okay, so he's dealt with the Persian navy, he's cut through the Gordian knot, literally, and he's marching deeper into Persia. But King Darius, he wasn't just sitting around waiting, was he?
Of course not. He was gathering his forces. This was going to be the big one, the decisive confrontation. And this leads to one of the most famous battles in history, the Battle of Issus in 333 BC.
Issus. This is where Darius himself leads the Persian army, right? Tries to trap Alexander.
Yep. Darius had assembled a huge army, maybe even 100,000 men. He picked a narrow plain by the town of Issus, thinking he could just overwhelm Alexander's smaller force with sheer numbers. Classic David versus Goliath scenario.
So knowing Alexander, how do you think he reacted to this? Did he back down? Seemed like impossible odds?
Nope, not Alexander. He saw an opportunity. The narrow battlefield, it actually played to his strengths. It meant the Persians couldn't fully utilize their numerical advantage, almost like Darius walked right into a trap.
So he turns a disadvantage into an advantage. Classic Alexander. So how did the battle unfold?
Well, Alexander, of course, he leads the charge with his companion cavalry, hitting the Persian left flank hard. It caused chaos. Meanwhile, the Macedonian phalanx, they engaged the Persian center.
And how did they hold up? Against those numbers, it must have been intense.
It was a tough fight. They held their ground, but the Persians, including their elite immortals, pushed hard against the Macedonian lines. For a while, it looked like the phalanx might actually break.
So what happened? Did Alexander pull off another, one of his crazy moves?
He did. Seeing his center struggling, Alexander rallied his companion cavalry and launched a devastating attack straight at Darius himself. Talk about a gamble. But it worked. Darius, he panicked and fled the battlefield.
Wow, he really leads by example. So what about the rest of the Persian army? What happened to them?
With their king gone, they totally fell apart. It was a rout. Alexander won a stunning victory, even capturing Darius's family. Though he treated them with respect, this was a huge psychological blow for the Persians. Their king of kings defeated by this young Macedonian upstart.
Issus was definitely a turning point, that's for sure. Alexander proved he could beat the Persians even when outnumbered. So what did he do next?
He continued south, securing those western regions of the Persian Empire. He ran into some fierce resistance, though. Cities like Tyre and Gaza, he had to capture them after lengthy sieges. Brutal stuff, but Alexander, he wasn't just about brute force. He also had a keen political sense.
Right, he was declared pharaoh in Egypt, wasn't he?
Exactly. He marched into Egypt, and they welcomed him as a liberator. Being crowned pharaoh, it was a brilliant move. It tapped into the Egyptians' resentment of Persian rule. And while he was there, he founded the city of Alexandria, the city that would become a major center of learning and trade.
So he's not just conquering, he's building, too. It's like he had a vision, something bigger than just military domination.
That's an important point, Alexander. He wasn't just about plunder and destruction. He had this vision, this idea of a world united under his rule, a world where Greek culture and ideas would, flourish. His empire didn't last, but his impact, well, it was huge. He set in motion this cultural exchange between East and West, and it had lasting consequences.
It's amazing how he balanced, the military stuff with these big ideas. So, okay, Alexander has conquered Asia Minor. He's routed the Persians at Issus. He's taken control of Egypt, founded Alexandria. What's next? Final showdown with Darius.
You'd think so, right? But being a king, even a conquering king, is never easy. While Alexander's out winning these incredible victories, trouble was brewing back home in Greece.
Oh, come on. Really? Even while he's conquering Persia, he can't escape those old Greek rivalries.
Nope. Seems that while Alexander was away, King Agis of Sparta, with a little help from the Persians, decided, hey, let's revolt against Macedonian rule. It was a reminder, I guess, that the Greek world was still pretty volatile, and Alexander's hold on power, well, it wasn't absolute.
So even with all these victories, he still had to worry about threats back home. Must have been frustrating. Did this revolt, derail his plans?
Luckily for Alexander, his regent back home, Antipater, was a really good commander. He faced the Spartan army near Megalopolis, and the Spartans, well, they had that legendary reputation for warfare, but Antipater, he crushed them. King Agis was killed in the battle, and the revolt was over.
Wow. So even when he's thousands of miles away, Alexander's forces are still winning battles. It's like he's playing chess on two boards at once.
That's a great way to put it. And with that threat gone, Alexander could finally focus on that final confrontation with Darius. The stage was set for an epic clash.
I can't wait to hear how it goes down. So where does this showdown take place?
The big one happens at Gaugamela in 331 BC, near modern-day Mosul in Iraq. Darius picked a wide-open plain. He was hoping to use his numerical advantage. He also had a new weapon, something designed to, terrify and break up the enemy formations. Scythed chariots.
Scythed chariots, what are those? They sound terrifying.
Chariots with blades mounted on the wheels. Imagine them scything through enemy ranks. They were as much a psychological weapon as a physical one, meant to instill fear and break up those enemy lines.
I can only imagine the chaos. So how did Alexander deal with these things?
Discipline and tactical flexibility. His troops, they were trained to open their ranks, let the chariots pass through harmlessly. Then they could be picked off by lighter troops armed with javelins. Classic example of adapting to a new threat, turning it against the enemy.
Amazing. Sounds like Alexander was always a step ahead. So, Gaugamela, did he pull off another incredible victory?
He did. It was a complicated battle, a lot of maneuvering on both sides, but Alexander, once again leading from the front, launched a cavalry charge that shattered the Persian center. And Darius, for the third time, fled the battlefield. It was a crushing defeat for the Persians, the end of their empire, really.
So that was it. Gaugamela sealed the deal. Alexander, he was the new master of Persia. What about Darius? What happened to him after this defeat?
He ran east. He was trying to raise another army, but he was betrayed, murdered by his own men. When Alexander found his body, he ordered a royal burial. A sign of respect, maybe? Or maybe a smart political move, signifying that he was the rightful heir to the throne.
It's amazing, really. He combined military brilliance with this sense of destiny, almost. It's like he was born to rule.
You're picking up on something there. There was the sense that Alexander, he was fulfilling some, grand destiny, and the Persian Empire was his, but his ambition wasn't satisfied. He was determined to keep going east, conquer the far reaches of the world, but these campaigns, they would bring new challenges, test the loyalty of his troops, and, well, reveal a darker side to his character.
This is where things get really interesting, right? The conqueror facing new trials, struggles within his own ranks as well as, external enemies. I'm ready to hear the final chapter of Alexander's incredible story. Okay, so Alexander's conquered Persia. He's on top of the world. What's next? Where does this insatiable ambition take him?
Eastward. He keeps pushing further and further into regions that, to the Greeks, were like shrouded in mystery. Modern-day Afghanistan, India, places that represented like the edge of the known world.
Wow, so he's really going into uncharted territory, both literally and figuratively. What kind of challenges did he face in these eastern campaigns? It couldn't have just been about marching and conquering anymore, right?
You got it. It became a lot more complex. He had to deal with rebellions from those local satraps, those Persian governors. They weren't too happy about submitting to this new ruler. And the terrain itself, it was brutal. Those mountains, like the Hindu Kush, those vast deserts, the unfamiliar rivers, it was a logistical nightmare.
That sounds intense. But those were the external challenges. You mentioned discontent within his own army. That's got to be a leader's worst nightmare.
It is. Alexander's troops, they'd been marching, fighting for years, far from home. They were weary, homesick. And some of them, they started to question this whole, endless pursuit of conquests. They'd won these incredible victories, amassed riches. They were probably thinking, when do we get to go home and enjoy it?
I can understand that. At some point, victory's got to feel kind of hollow, right? If you never get to, savor it. Alexander must have been feeling the pressure, too.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where you start to see some cracks in his leadership. He was still brilliant militarily, but his judgment, his temperament, maybe it was starting to be affected by the pressure, the paranoia that comes with, absolute power.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's that story about Parmenion, one of his most trusted generals. He's executed. What happened there? It seems so out of character for, the Alexander we've gotten to know so far.
It does, yeah. The details, they're a bit murky, lost to history. But it seems Alexander was getting more and more suspicious of the people around him, fearing conspiracies. Parmenion's own son, he was implicated in some kind of plot against Alexander. He was executed. And then Parmenion himself, even with his years of loyal service, he was put to death too, probably to prevent any chance of, revenge, an uprising.
Wow. That's dark. It shows you the toll that power, that paranoia can take, even on the greatest leaders. But Alexander, he kept going. He continued pushing east into India. That's where he faced King Porus and those legendary war elephants, right?
Yep. The Battle of the Hydaspes River, 326 BC. Just imagine the scene. King Porus with his army and these massive elephants, armored, trained for battle, facing Alexander and his Macedonians. It must have been an incredible sight. Terrifying and, awe-inspiring at the same time.
I can only imagine. How did Alexander's army, they were used to fighting in a certain way. How did they deal with these war elephants? Did they just panic?
I'm sure it was pretty scary. Those elephants inflicted some serious casualties. But Alexander's forces, they used skillful maneuvering and a lot of courage, and they managed to win. Hard-fought victory. A real testament to their ability to adapt, their discipline. It came at a cost. Alexander's army, they were already exhausted, longing for home. And this battle, it pushed them to their absolute limit.
And that leads us to the mutiny on the Hyphasis River, right? When even Alexander, even with his leadership, he couldn't overcome his troops' exhaustion.
That's it. The Hyphasis River, or the Bees River today, it marks the furthest point of Alexander's conquests. His men, they were just done. Weary of the endless campaigning, there were rumors of even bigger armies further east, and they just said, no more. It's a pivotal moment. This seemingly invincible Alexander, he's forced to acknowledge the limits of his own power.
What a turning point. So what did he do? Did he try to punish them?
He didn't really have a choice. His dream of conquering all the way to the Eastern Ocean, as the Greeks imagined it, that was over. He turned his army around, and the long journey home began.
So even the retreat, it was a challenge. It wasn't some, triumphant return.
No, it was full of hardship. Part of his army sailed back. With his admiral Nereus, they went along the coast of the Persian Gulf into the Arabian Sea. That in itself was an incredible feat of navigation back then, but Alexander, he led the rest of the army back overland. Through the Gadrosan Desert, modern-day southern Pakistan, Iran, it was brutal. Scorching heat, limited supplies, the threat of attack. A lot of his troops died during that march.
What a difficult end to such a, epic campaign. He makes it back to Persia, but his empire, it's facing new problems. What happens in these last years of his life?
There was still unrest, and he's ruthless in putting it down. He purges corrupt officials. He also tries to integrate the Macedonians and Persians, arranges mass marriages even between his officers and Persian noblewomen, maybe trying to create a more unified empire, leave a lasting legacy. But time was running out for Alexander.
Because in 323 BC, at only 32 years old, he dies in Babylon. The cause of death is still a mystery, right?
It is. So many theories. Malaria, typhoid, poisoning. The ancient sources, they contradict each other. They're not always reliable. Whatever the cause, his death, it was a shock. It sent shockwaves through the entire empire. Even the most powerful individuals, they're still mortal.
So what happened to this vast empire once Alexander was gone? Did it hold together?
It fell apart pretty quickly. Alexander, he didn't leave a clear heir. And his generals, the Diadochi, started fighting among themselves for control. The empire was carved up into successor kingdoms, each ruled by one of Alexander's former companions. It was a chaotic time, a lot of bloodshed, ambition, I guess.
So Alexander's dream of a unified empire, it died with him. Was that it for his legacy?
Politically, yes. His empire, it was torn apart. But his legacy, it's much more complex. Alexander's conquests, they ushered in the Hellenistic age, this period of incredible cultural exchange between Greece and the East. Greek ideas, language, art, philosophy, it all spread throughout his former empire, mixed with local traditions, created these vibrant hybrid cultures.
So Alexander the Great, brilliant military leader, ruthless conqueror, but also, in a way, a cultural visionary. Sounds like a pretty complicated legacy.
That's it. He's hard to categorize. Capable of great cruelty, but also remarkable generosity. Driven by ambition, yes, but also, it seems, by a real curiosity about the world. He was a product of his time, but he also transcended it. He left a mark on history we're still talking about him today.
It's been an amazing journey, exploring his life, his legacy. What stands out to you most? What's his impact, really?
It's incredible how, after all these centuries, Alexander still captures our imaginations. This guy, he lived over 2,000 years ago, but his name, it's still synonymous with ambition, military genius, that relentless pursuit of what seems impossible. He achieved so much, and so young. But his story, it's also a cautionary tale about the fleeting nature of power, the corrupting influence of ambition, but also the enduring power of ideas.
Lots of lessons there. For our listeners who want to learn more, dive deeper into this fascinating period, I highly recommend Osprey Publishing. They've got tons of great resources on Alexander, his campaigns, his army, you name it.
It's a fascinating period, really. Always something new to learn. Alexander himself might have said there's always another world to conquer, even if that world is, just our own understanding of the past.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into the world of Alexander the Great. Thanks for joining us. And we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of history.